Thank you. Nebraska Medicine's interim chancellor is breaking his silence after the hospital abruptly dropped its lawsuit against the Nebraska Board of Regents. That lawsuit alleged the university wanted unfettered access to donor funds that could be used for non-healthcare purposes. But after the Board of Regents replaced the entire board, the lawsuit vanished. Our Brenna Kiefner has the first interview with the chancellor since the lawsuit was dropped. She joins us live in the newsroom with the latest. Brenna.
Jacqueline, this has been a power struggle, and tonight we're learning how quickly the new board moved to end it. Interim Chancellor Dr. Dele Davies told me they've already held board meetings and made some decisions. But here's what's raising eyebrows. The original board was willing to lose their jobs fighting for Nebraska Medicine's independence. The new board, they dropped the lawsuit in just weeks. This all started in January when the Board of Regents approved an $800 million deal with Clarkson Health, giving the university full control of Nebraska Medicine. Nebraska Medicine's former board fought back with a lawsuit, making some serious allegations. The university wanted unfettered access to hospital funds for non-healthcare purposes, like covering the university's budget problems. NU's president already had said publicly the deal would help the financially troubled university manage its budget. The former board also argued the deal might not be in the best interests of Nebraska Medicine's independence. The Board of Regents and Clarkson responded pretty swiftly, firing the board, saying their actions threaten the organization's reputation and stability.
We already share the same logo, right? We have the same mission statement, we have the same values. And so what this allows us to do is to continue to walk together, move together forward in a way where we continue to strengthen each other's ability to serve the people of Nebraska.
And here's the key detail. That lawsuit was dismissed without prejudice. That legal language basically means it could be refiled if things go wrong. The Board of Regents and Clarkson are targeting June to finalize the deal. And we reached out to former board members for their perspective, but did not hear back. Live in the newsroom, Brenna Kiefner, First Alert 6.
All right, thanks for keeping us abreast of the latest developments, Brenna.